II, assaults on a foreign shore were carried out with heavy naval bombardment and all-out marine attacks to establish a beachhead. Although the helicopter existed, it was not ready for use as an offensive tool. Then came the atomic bomb, which threw traditional military thinking into chaos. Military tacticians developed a theoretical role for helicopter. Conventional war broke out in Asia. Those who championed the helicopter as a military tool were caught napping. On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops crossed the dividing line between Communist North Korea and the Republic of Korea in the south. 16 countries joined under the banner of the United Nations to reject this aggression. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied forces halted the North Korean push and were defending the South Korean port of Busan. The helicopter was still an infant, and there were only a few in the field. But commanders on the ground knew of their potential in reconnaissance, and they came into service in the first few days of the war as eyes of the United Nations forces. In the 40s, helicopter manufacturers like Sikorsky, Bell, Piasecki, and Kaman had flamboyantly promoted the helicopter, but relatively few military dollars had been spent on them. In the United States, the industry was still trying to convince the military of the helicopter's real worth. Sergei Sikorsky of Sikorsky Aircraft.
This changed very suddenly in 1951 when North Korea invaded South Korea. And within about 2 or 3 days, the helicopter had proven its worth so much as a reconnaissance and as medical evacuation and everything else that the cry went out, get us more helicopters, send us all you can. And I would call the Korean War the war that proved the military usefulness of the helicopter.
Suddenly, the production lines began to move faster. In the Sikorsky plant at Bridgeport, Connecticut, the S-55, with its large 550 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine located in the nose, began to roll out in larger quantities. The same thing happened at the Bell factory in Buffalo, New York. The helicopter was on its way to war. The war that nobody expected ran on through autumn of 1950 and into winter of 1951. The conditions were bitter, and every day that passed strengthened the helicopter's claim as a worthwhile military vehicle. Snow and ice made movement on the primitive roads difficult. The terrain was rugged. Flash floods occurred in the river valleys, cutting off communications. Suitable landing areas for fixed-wing aircraft were limited. The fighting was intense, and there were many casualties. Moving these casualties overland to the Medical Army Surgical Hospitals, or MASH units, was a slow and painful process. The situation was perfect for a helicopter like the Sikorsky S-51. The design was more than 5 years old, and it was one of the first types in Korea. The helicopter's ability to land aboard ship and provide fast communication, or to help people in otherwise inaccessible situations, had long been realized, and Korea provided opportunities every day for the helicopter to show its versatility. Helicopters in the early 1950s were still slow, uncomfortable, and underpowered. The S-51, with its 450 horsepower radial engine, had a maximum lifting capacity of only 3 passengers, or 950 pounds. When the larger Sikorsky S-55 came into the field, it brought a lifting capacity of 10 passengers, or 2,855 pounds. With the Army designation H-19, One of these helicopters was put through a severe test of lift capacity in early 1951. It was given the task of retrieving the engine and tail section of a crippled MiG-15 for examination by American Air Force analysts. And it succeeded, while also carrying 6 very thin South Korean soldiers and an American jet fighter expert. At this time, aerial photo reconnaissance was the province of fixed-wing aircraft. It was essential to monitor the effect of Allied attacks on North Korean positions and to plot the location of North Korean anti-aircraft batteries. Regulations prevented helicopters in the Korean War flying where they were in danger of enemy fire. Nevertheless, they were used in reconnaissance roles, and inevitably they came under ground fire. Inevitably also, they were sometimes hit, and one even managed to explode an enemy mine with its rotor downwash from 300 feet in the air. In mid-1951, peace talks began and continued throughout the next 2 years. Helicopters transported Allied negotiators to the conference table, but it was in another area entirely that the helicopter really made its reputation. Lines of refugees fleeing from the communist forces stretch for miles on the roads of South Korea. These thousands upon thousands of homeless and hungry people provided some kind of visible justification for the United Nations troops fighting far from home in bitter and difficult conditions. They needed such a symbol. In the first 6 months of the war, over 60,000 United Nations troops were wounded in defending South Korea. At the end of those 6 months, the Bell 47, the Angel of Mercy, Army designation H-13, arrived in Korea. The first medical evacuations, 6 weeks after war broke out, had been carried out by Sikorsky H-5s. In December 1950, Bell H-13s fitted with stretcher pods on the landing skids were assigned directly to the MASH units. The designer of the Bell helicopter, Arthur Young.
I remember when I put the skids on, I thought it would be handy for people wanting to jump on like a fire engine. They could stand. I didn't think that you could put the stretchers on there too, but it worked out very nicely to carry the stretchers.
The Medevac Bell H-13s went into action in the first week of 1951 when the Chinese launched an offensive against the UN forces. Their impact was immediate. They cut the time needed to get a wounded soldier to MASH facilities by a factor of 10. Apart from reaching treatment sooner, this meant that soldiers who would have died on the road were still alive by the time medical treatment was available. These helicopter mercy rides were not available to every soldier injured in the field. Only the seriously wounded qualified. This category of injuries became known as helicopter wounds. The immediate success of the medevac helicopters changed the way armed forces handled wounded soldiers in combat. Traditionally, wounded had been divided into 3 categories. 1, the walking wounded. 2, those with serious wounds that were not life-threatening. 3, those who were gravely injured and in need of medical care to survive. Under this system, the most seriously injured had been the last to receive medical attention. The military rationale was that several soldiers in the second category could be treated in the same time it took to treat one of the gravely injured. Now, if a helicopter was available, the most serious cases could be transported to surgical attention in quick time. The priorities were changed, and the gravely wounded were taken first, and mortality rates on the battlefield dropped astonishingly. Not only were the MASH units placed within easy reach, but offshore hospital ships were suddenly accessible by air. Although the Bell H-13 became known as the Angel of Mercy, Other helicopters were involved in medevac and rescue work. Sikorsky H-5s had pioneered medical evacuation. As the war progressed, they were fitted with pods like those of the Bell H-13. But in the early months, their facilities had been more primitive. They'd been adapted to carry wounded in stretchers, with their legs protruding through an open window. The Sikorsky S-55, here in the Marine version, designation HRS, brought a new standard of comfort and lifting ability to medevac. The large forward-mounted WASP radial engine gave it the power and space to carry 8 stretchers inside its large cabin. Not only did this provide insulation from the icy air outside, but for the first time it made in-flight medical attention a real possibility. Pilots in the smaller helicopters had done what they could while keeping their machines in the air, but now dedicated care could be offered on the way to a hospital unit. And so the process continued throughout the war. HRSs, H-19s, Bell H-13s, and Sikorsky H-5s picking up wounded from the aid stations and taking them on to MASH units or hospital ships. The number of medevac helicopters in Korea was never very great, but their influence on the treatment of wounded in war was immeasurable. The helicopter also made another kind of mercy mission possible. Quick rescue of downed pilots from inaccessible positions on land and sea became daily occurrences, often under enemy fire. But the helicopter had other uses away from the front. It was ideal for setting up lines of communication. This Bell H-13 is fitted for wire laying. It has a spool mounted between the skids, so the wire can pay out freely. Using this technique, Army communication lines could be set up in a fraction of the time it took to achieve on the ground. It also meant that lines could be laid in locations that were otherwise completely inaccessible. If a helicopter or an airplane went down, it was no longer a case of having to write it off completely. Even large helicopters of the time could not lift the whole thing out, but usable parts could be salvaged. The parts could be packed into or slung under a Sikorsky HRS and flown back to base, where they were recycled into the spares inventory. But while there was no doubt about the potential of big helicopters in Korea, delivery was frustratingly slow. Helicopters provided service in other less spectacular ways than medevac or search and rescue. Delivery of mail from home and fresh food supplies could be made to troops in advanced positions on inaccessible high ground, out of reach of the normal transportation system. Occasions like these, unprecedented in the history of warfare, were great morale boosters. The helicopter's first flirtation with tactical missions was reminiscent of World War I, with phosphorus bombs delivered by hand out the side door to the target below. But the idea of the helicopter as an offensive tool was to be developed by the Marines in this conflict, not so much as a vehicle for carrying weapons, as a vehicle for transporting troops over natural obstacles to engage the enemy where he least expected it. This tactic, known as vertical envelopment, had been experimented with before the war. In order to work effectively, it needed big helicopters in reasonably large numbers, to transport an effective force in the shortest possible time. HRSs had been used to evacuate troops from difficult locations, but now it was time to use their large lifting capacity in an offensive role. This is an early vertical envelopment operation, an experiment under actual combat conditions. 230 Marines are being loaded into Sikorsky HRSs for transport to an inaccessible mountaintop behind North Korean lines. First to go is the shore party, whose objective is to establish the position and prepare it for the helicopters bringing in the bulk of the troops. Their flight in the helicopter takes them over terrain that would need days of back-breaking slog to penetrate on the ground. The idea is to disembark the helicopter as quickly as possible. But this is a first, and knotted ropes are not that easy to come to terms with. Once on the ground, the shore party's job is to clear the area and secure it before the main body of Marines arrives in the HRSs. Now the ground has been cleared. The main body of helicopters can land to unload their complement of troops. The knotted rope is no longer a factor, but speed is still essential, since each HRS must get out of the way to allow the next one to come in. Each HRS is carrying 6 fully equipped Marines. They move out of the helicopters to their assigned positions to establish a 360-degree perimeter defense. Some of the troops are assigned to patrols, and others to forward positions to protect the main body. These machine gun sites are chosen for their ability to command avenues of enemy approach. Once they're set up, it becomes a waiting game. North Korean prisoners taken by the patrols are bewildered at the sudden appearance of American Marines behind the North Korean lines. They offer the Americans their safe conduct passes, psychological warfare surrender vouchers. The next stage of the operation is the transportation of supplies. They arrive on the same helicopters that brought the troops. Like the troops, they make the journey in hours rather than the days a land operation would have taken. The speed of the unloading process is assisted by a quick release arrangement on the slings, so the helicopter only has to pause for a moment before returning to base. Small offensive actions like this were the forerunner of full-scale vertical envelopment operations, launched from both land bases and offshore carriers. On October 11, 1951, the Marines launched Operation Bumblebee, the first battalion-strength helicopter lift of troops. Military history was in the making. History fashioned by the availability of the helicopter on the field of battle. In Operation Bumblebee, almost 1,000 Marines were loaded in successive waves into 12 HRSs. In 156 flights over a period of 6 hours, they were transported to a 3,000-foot mountaintop 15 miles away. The Marines were making use of Igor Sikorsky's concept of total freedom of transportation. With helicopters, they could surmount land and water and drop their cargo of troops on the least accessible of objectives.
By the time we saw the 50s come around, we saw a greater capability being developed in the vertical flight or the helicopter arena. And the Army took advantage of this because it gave them mobility over the ground, slightly over the ground, got them up out of the mud, muck, and mire, and also afforded them the opportunity to traverse around obstacles that normally would hinder their operational capability.
Helicopters had their place in almost every aspect of the war in Korea. Attempts to negotiate a truce occupied 2 years of effort, and the helicopter did its part in making sure the United Nations negotiators arrived at the conference table as conveniently as possible. But the enduring image of the helicopter from Korea will always be the Angel of Mercy, the Medevac Bell 47, Army designation H-13, with its distinctive rotor noise and 2 pods mounted on the skids to carry gravely wounded soldiers to immediate medical attention. The Apache attack helicopter. From the helicopter point of view, the star of Operation Desert Storm, the result of a line of development that began back in the 1960s.
I would have to tell you that when we came out of Vietnam in the early 70s, there was a serious challenge about whether or not air mobility could support land forces elsewhere in the world. Recall in the early 70s, the chief threat at that moment was the Soviet threat, the Warsaw Pact, Europe, very sophisticated integrated air defenses, heavy-duty anti-tank weapons. Could helicopters survive in that kind of environment? And that brought a whole new change to the tactical application of the lessons that we learned over 9 years in Vietnam.
The AH-1 Huey Cobra was the start of the modern attack helicopter line. Before it arrived on the Vietnam scene in 1967, there had only been a few factory experiments and some conversions of helicopters designed for other purposes. Not that the Cobra was new from the ground up. It used the engine, rotors, and drive system from the UH-1 Huey. But on the outside at least, it was an attack helicopter. It was fast, it had a narrow, hard-to-hit fuselage, good visibility for pilot and gunner, and was heavily armed. Unlike the Cobra, the Lockheed AH-56 Cheyenne was a complete purpose-built attack helicopter. It used the Lockheed rigid rotor system and had a pusher rotor on the tail for high-speed level flight. Short stub wings provided lift at high forward speeds and put the Cheyenne in the compound helicopter class. The heart of the Cheyenne's armament was the new tow wire-guided anti-tank missile system. The Cheyenne carried 6 tow missiles. It also had a 7.62 millimeter minigun and a 30 millimeter anti-tank cannon. The Cheyenne was the winner of a 1966 Advanced Aerial Fire Support competition for the U.S. Army. The Army ordered 10 for evaluation. During forward flight, most of the engine's power drove the rear pusher propeller, with only about 25% going to the main rotor. This gave a top speed of 240 miles an hour, and its ability to fly fast and low was highly developed for the time. The flexible weapons system was computer-assisted and utilized laser and Doppler radar information. It could keep the flexible weapons trained on the target throughout the period of engagement. The gunner only needed to make minor adjustments and press the button. The tandem seating arrangement with a huge transparent canopy gave superb all-around visibility to the pilot and the gunner. The pilot could fire at any target he could see. He just had to aim with his helmet sight, select his weapon system, and shoot. The rocket system was very accurate. Level approaches at low altitude avoided the need for exposure to enemy fire. The Cheyenne was impressive, with its high performance, purpose-built design and devastating firepower. Its tow wire-guided missile system made it a lethal tank killer. But because of cost overruns and changes in military philosophy, the Cheyenne project was canceled in 1972. Late in the Vietnam War, Hueys equipped with tow missiles had great success against North Vietnamese tanks and tracked vehicles. But American helicopters didn't have it all their own way. In the closing stages of the conflict, the opposition became tougher.
At the conclusion of the war in Vietnam, the situation changed to where different tactics had to be derived. Once you started running into the radar-directed gun systems, into IR missile systems and things of that nature, the tactics drove the helicopters down on the deck where they were below the radar line of sight.
Once the Vietnam War was over, military attention focused once again on the possibility of a conflict between the NATO alliance and the Warsaw Pact countries. Vietnam had been a special case, and now the question was whether the helicopter was capable against highly sophisticated electronic defense systems. The Huey Cobra was still a serviceable attack helicopter, but a new player was about to enter the game. In the mid-70s, the Army held its Advanced Attack Helicopter competition. It called for a helicopter that could operate in day, night, and adverse weather conditions from the front line. The final selection was made in December 1976. The winner was the Hughes YAH-64, the Apache. Major General Ostovich.
Now, instead of a Huey that was converted to a tandem-seated Cobra that had all the vulnerabilities of a civilian helicopter made to look like an attack helicopter, now we had an Apache that was designed with a rotor system that could take heavy-duty air defense hits, 12.7 AAA fire, and the machine continues to fly. Protected seats and protected environments around critical components, redundant systems. And so that whole growth of what we call in the United States Army our modern Army aviation fleet of helicopters came out of the early 70s and based on our lessons in Vietnam.
In January 1984, the first Apache entered service. The modern attack helicopter had finally come of age. The Apache is designed to engage the enemy from the front line. It has an extremely accurate navigation system. Its exposure time to the enemy during attack is short, and it has a low signature. It can kill with the first round and go on to the next target. The Apache can perform day or night in all weather. The Apache's weapons include a 30mm chain gun cannon, laser-guided Hellfire missiles, and 70mm rockets. Its weapons control system is highly sophisticated. The target acquisition designation sight operates with the fire control computer and integrated helmet sight. It has a stabilized sight for day and night operation. But the Apache is also designed to take punishment as well as handing it out. A rigorous development and testing program has made it able to withstand most hits. It has high ballistic tolerance in all its systems, and all this without the need for heavy armor. Almost all the armor on the Apache is used for crew and fuel protection. For General Ostovich and his pilots, the effectiveness of this protection was proven in the Gulf War.
One Apache took 2 rounds right up through the fuselage, right up through the right-hand engine nacelle. The hole in that aircraft was large enough you could put your fist through it. And listening to the videotape on board the aircraft, talk to the pilot is racing back now to his base, saying, "I think I'm hit. I'm feeling some vibration." but continuing to fly. Returns the aircraft to the base, repairs the aircraft, rejoins the fight. But that's the kind of tough, durable airframes that we're flying today.
The Apache cruises at 180 miles an hour with a top speed of 235. It can fly sideways and backwards at over 50 miles an hour. It's highly maneuverable and can make very fast changes of flight path while it's flying close to the ground with no danger of structural damage. At sea level, it has a mission time of up to 2 hours and 40 minutes. The flight sensation is vibration-free, which makes it less fatiguing to fly than older helicopters. The Apache was the spearhead of U.S. helicopter forces in the Gulf War.
The growth of assault helicopters that were not adaptations of civilian helicopters, but began with a blank piece of paper and said, now if you want to design a helicopter that must fly into the jaws of the enemy's camp, what would you have in it? Well, we'd want it to be survivable, protect the crew, protect the infantrymen on board, be able to take abuse. Out of that kind of design effort came the Black Hawk.
The Sikorsky H-60 Black Hawk had to follow a tough act when it was introduced to service in 1979. It was chosen by the Army to replace the venerable Huey, which has given extremely effective service since the early 60s. It has a crew of 3 and can carry 11 combat-equipped troops. The Army specification called for a sustainable cruising speed over 200 miles an hour. The Black Hawk was a key member of the highly organized helicopter system that went to Saudi Arabia in 1990 to join Operation Desert Shield.
In the United States Army, the helicopter forces are organic to all of our divisions and to all of our corps. The division and the corps commander does not have to ask anyone to get attack helicopter support or lift or any of the helicopter support that you would expect. It's all part of his combat force, both his combat arm and his combat support arm.
The McDonnell Douglas Defender dates from 1968 and is one of the helicopters in the Gulf Force that also saw service in Vietnam. It can operate as a light observation helicopter, but armed with tow missiles, it can be a particularly effective tank killer. The largest helicopter in the Gulf War was the Sikorsky Super Stallion. It was a formidable member of the team, with its immense heavy lift capacity and its ability to carry 55 battle-ready troops. The Super Stallion came into service in 1980, and since then has been a key factor in contributing to the mobility of the U.S. helicopter force.
The modern helicopter gives to a land force the ability to move faster and attack quicker his enemy. It gives to our land forces the possibility of designing a battlefield scheme that avoids the frontal confrontation.
Another Vietnam veteran to see Gulf service was the Boeing CH-47 Chinook. But the Chinooks coming into service now are a far cry from those that were produced in the mid-60s. The contemporary Chinook has new electronics and avionics, and its crash survivability has been brought up to current standards. It's still a key member of the U.S. helicopter force. In the early hours of the morning of January 17, 1991, a force of 8 Apaches crossed the Iraqi border without lights. They were flying fast and close to the ground. Their mission was to destroy 2 Iraqi radar stations. At 2:38 a.m., they released their missiles, laser-guided Hellfires, then Hydra rockets, then cannon fire. Within seconds, the Apaches had established a radar-free corridor. Coalition aircraft, could now fly through undetected. Apaches had struck the first blow of Desert Storm.
I, quite frankly, became a little bit excited as I saw the Iraqi military begin to dig in their tank forces along the southern Kuwaiti border. For an attack helicopter pilot, a tank sitting behind a three-sided berm is just a very inviting target. You got to make it a little bit more difficult than that.
About 400 Black Hawks served in Desert Storm. Some flew under their own power as far as 3,500 miles from Germany. They operated as the workhorse of the helicopter fleet and flew 44,000 hours in the Gulf. Vital to the operation of the helicopter forces were the soldiers of the forward area refueling points. They could refuel and rearm an Apache in about 20 minutes, operating close to the front line. To get an Apache to the front, you need to get it into the country, and C-130s, C-131s, C-17s, and C-5As were used to move them. Apaches of the 82nd Helicopter Battalion were on the first transport to arrive in the Gulf. Every year, the U.S. and Egyptian forces stage maneuvers called Operation Bright Star. For those who'd been involved in Bright Star, unloading helicopters in the desert was not a new experience, but they may never have come into contact with Chinooks wrapped up like this. In spite of the fact that Black Hawks superseded the Hueys in 1979, there were still some Hueys in service in the Gulf. Hot, sandy conditions caused a variety of maintenance problems, including rotor damage and engine sand erosion. Another veteran whose service can be traced back to Vietnam is the Huey Cobra. This version, the Marine Sea Cobra, has 2 engines. Sea Cobras are equipped with TOW and Hellfire missiles, which make it possible to engage targets from relatively safe standoff range. Sea Cobras were active from the start of ground fighting and supported the Marines' artillery with their missile and rocket fire. A Marine said that in one operation, a Cobra was so close he could reach up and touch its skid as its hot cannon shells rained down. The Desert Ducks, out of Norfolk, Virginia, is a group of 30-year-old Sikorsky Sea Kings based in the Gulf since 1972. In Desert Shield and Desert Storm, the Ducks delivered mail and gave logistical support service. The harsh desert conditions kept ground crews working to keep the old helicopters in the air. The coalition tactics were based on aggression and extreme mobility. General Ostovich.
Hold them by the nose. Engage them so that they can't reposition. And while you're doing that, move around with great speed, around the flank, attack from the back, attack from the side, cut off their avenues of reinforcement, cut off their supplies. Begin the attack back in the mess hall. Begin the attack back where the tanks and trucks are being retrofitted and repaired. Destroy the logistics base. Move in then for the kill from the backside. That took a few hours.
A helicopter force like this had never before been unleashed in the full heat of battle. Time after time, the Iraqi forces seemed to be beaten before the fight began.
As you talk to the pilots, it's a curious story. You can almost see what's going on in the enemy commander's mind. The armor force says, can't go that way. Tanks are burning. Turns the force to the right, tries to get to Basra, and then come around to the north. Apaches range faster than the tanks. Destroy the lead elements of those tanks. They're on fire. Now the entire division is stopped, trapped by their own burning hulks, either on the left and on the right. And then very curious thing happened. The Apache pilots just waited. Just waited. They knew their enemy didn't have a chance. And so they just waited. Tankers got out of their tanks. infantrymen got out of their infantry fighting vehicles, threw down their weapons, ran out into the desert. And when they were cleared, the Apache force utterly destroyed that division. Nothing left.
At the start of Desert Storm, the U.S. Army had 11 aviation brigades in Saudi Arabia, with a total of 1,800 helicopters. One Apache battalion destroyed 157 tanks, 40 armored personnel carriers, 40 trucks, and 23 bunkers. The defeat of the huge Iraqi land force was a complex operation involving all the armed forces with their extraordinary range of advanced weaponry. As part of this team, the contemporary high-tech helicopter force gave the ground forces unprecedented mobility and striking power.
So technology, in many ways, helped us grow the capability that we enjoy today. It's kind of interesting to look back now in I would say the last 30 years of modern Army aviation and see the relationship between technology and capability and how that was exploited to produce what I think is the world's greatest attack and assault helicopter force in the world.
Desert Storm settled any lingering doubts about the attack helicopter's ability to hold its own in a modern war. According to some experts, it has tipped the balance to the extent that the helicopter is now being seen as a possible successor to the